Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Engstrand-Jakshu. I am the head of communications here at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. We're about now to start the webinar, Shortcomings and Broken Promises, Post-Election Reflections on Realizing the Gender Quota in Kenya. A few points of housekeeping first. After the presentations, we of course welcome questions from participants. But please note that the questions need to be posted in the Q&A function, which will be monitored by us. If you have any other question about technical issues or anything such, please send them to myself or to my colleague Mia Hellström in the chat function. But with that, I'd like to hand over to the director of the Nordic Africa Institute, Dr. Therese Sjömander Magnusson, to say a few words of welcome. The room is yours, Therese.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and a good afternoon to everyone. And welcome to this webinar on the Kenya elections, which also includes the launch of the associated NI policy notes called Gender Gains Overshadowed by Constitutional Violation. The recent Kenyan elections, especially the battle between two male presidential candidates, attracted a lot of attention, while the gendered perspectives was given less attention. And as the post-election gender results were mixed, it calls for further analysis and deliberations. Therefore, the aim of today's webinar is to look beyond the formal election as such, as most of the struggle for women's political participation takes place in between electoral cycles. The challenging conditions that women in politics have to navigate within sets the agenda for whether inclusive and transformative feminist political leadership can be achieved. A few months ago, we organized a very interesting webinar on the topic of why African authoritarian regimes promote women leaders. The research on authoritarian regimes and women's political representation particularly stresses the need to look beyond numbers and an isolated focus on adoption of gender equality reforms. As I see it, many related issues discussed at that webinar has relevance for today's discussions. At the Nordic Africa Institute, research within the area of women's political representation in Africa is very much in line with our institutional strategy, particularly within the impact area of equality, social justice, and inclusion. We see our role as in providing a platform for dialogue between Nordic and African researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. Therefore, I'm very pleased to see such a prominent list of speakers and panelists from Kenya who joins us online today. This webinar takes place at a time when we at the Nordic Africa Institute celebrate our 60th anniversary. We will continue to do more research into the dynamics of gender, elections, and violence against women in politics in different African contexts, and where the co-creation of knowledge together with partners in Africa has been and will continue to be a very central part of what we do. It is now time for me to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Diana Hayden Madsen, Senior Gender Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, who will facilitate today's discussions. Thank you, and over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Therese. As stated, I'm the Senior Gender Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. During the 2022 elections, promises were made to the Kenyan women on their political participation, including implementation of the gender quota. However, even after the elections, Kenya is lagging far behind other countries in the East African region with gender quotas. This webinar launches the policy note, Gender Gains Overshadowed by Constitutional Violation, It explored the variations and workings of the gender quotas and the institutional barriers working against more women in political offices. To deliberate over these questions and look forward, we have 3 representatives from Kenya with expertise in gender and women's political participation. However, the program will be as follows. First, there will be a presentation of the findings of the policy note by Dr. Sheila Minusi and myself. Sheila Minusi is a policy analyst with a PhD in development sociology from the University of Beirut in Germany. Her research expertise is feminist institutionalism and women's political representation. Her PhD mainly centered around the focus on women's political representation in Kenya, with a specific focus on the ethnic group, the Maasai. Afterwards, we will have some short interventions from our 3 Kenyan representatives or speakers. First, from Ruto, who is the current national chairperson of the organization's Maendeleo ya Wanawake, which means, I believe, the development of women in Kiswahili. It is one of the oldest and largest women's organizations in Kenya and founded in year 1952. She is also the chairperson of an African Center for Empowerment, Gender and Advocacy, an international NGO which used to be involved in UN and regional work covering African Union and NEPAD, among others. Furthermore, she is a renowned Kenyan entrepreneur who pioneered the weaving and marketing of Kenyan handicrafts. And she has been instrumental in empowering Kenyan women economically. Also, we welcome Maureen Odera from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. She is a project coordinator there with a specific focus on gender democracy. She is a humanitarian, a feminist, and a gender practitioner that advocates for the rights of women and girls while pushing for gender diversity and inclusion. She holds a soft spot for gender-focused projects and organizations that are working towards the advancement of policy, advocacy, and development through a gender lens. She has over 10 years of experience with gender mainstreaming in program design, project management, stakeholder engagement, and knowledge generation platform. She is also a content creator and founder of Lelo Speaks, a voice platform for women to be heard without judgment, and a part of Unmothering the Women Collective, whose objective is to shed light on various perspectives on motherhood. Lastly, but not least, we have Patience Nwange. She is a known gender and human rights activist and an accomplished media and communication practitioner, and she has 18 years of experience in that field. She is also very passionate about women's and girls' rights, specifically in advancing women's voices and empowerment. She is also the founder of Kenyan Women Series, a platform to create incredible, inspiring, powerhouse Kenyan women. In the just concluded general election, Patience ran for the governor's position in Taita Taveta County, but lost in that election. So we will hear about her experiences from that election. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A session. So please type your questions in the Q&A section of the screen here. So first we will start with the findings from the policy note, and I will share a PowerPoint. Please, Sheila, the platform is yours.
All right. Thank you, Diana, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for this presentation, which is a presentation of the policy note that Diana and myself worked on. and an open discussion on the general gender performance in the elections and what this means for the continued active participation of Kenyan women in politics. I will just, Diana, have you shared the PowerPoint?
I don't really know what.
Mia?
You can't share it, Diana?
No, it seems like.
It's fine, then I can just continue with then the copy I have got. Nope.
I'm
Try
not really
to-
sure what.
Diana, if you email it to me, I will share it if you're not able to share. It's strange.
Yeah.
It's worked when we tried it.
Yeah.
I could also try sharing my screen before then maybe Diana, for your bit, you could share your screen.
Mm.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
The problem is that I cannot see what you can see. So I hope it looks okay. Yeah.
Sorry, Sheila, you can choose the book that down in the right corner. There is like an open book. If
There?
you choose that one, then we will see. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Oh, sorry. So shortcomings and broken promises, post-election reflections on Kenya. And this is a policy note that Diana and myself worked on and is available online. And I'm hoping that you've all managed to have a read through. So just a bit of a background that these elections took part in August of this year. And it's the third round of elections under the new constitution that was passed in 2010. So the main elections, the official election date was on the 9th of August. The results were announced on the 15th, but then they were contested. And like the previous election, the contestation went to the Supreme Court, and the final judgment accepting the results of the Electoral Commission was communicated on the 13th of September by the on the 5th of September, and the new president was sworn in on the 13th of September. And as has already been mentioned, the major point of this election cycle was that it saw the formation of two main coalitions by two gentlemen who've been active in politics, one longer than the other. So of course, the discussion on dynasties was part of the electoral discourse. And a very important thing to note in this election cycle, just as gender was a main issue, there was the issue of ethnicity, which has for the longest time been a thorny issues in Kenyan politics, where there has been the instrumentalization of tribal identities and manipulation of ethnic grievances. And for those who are aware of just the history of elections in Kenya, you might be very well informed of the various cycles of post-electoral violence that we've had, and especially the 2017 cycle. But so that was part of the reason why the two candidates from the two major coalitions chose a Kikuyu candidate, because for the first time we did not have a presidential candidate from the Kikuyu community, which is an ethnic majority. And so for many, this was seen as a way of appeasing the masses, so that you have the majority as part of the whichever coalition would end up getting in power. So an appeasement process, if you'd like to look at it that way. And a very big step in ensuring that, you know, ethnic grievances do not come out as part of the electioneering process and the effects thereafter. So basically, more or less a way of containing or ensuring that we do not have any violence based on ethnic grounds. And that worked well, I would say. And I hope my fellow Kenyans would be able to comment on that later on. So as a key issue on this policy note, of course, gender, it was and continues to be a key point of discussion in Kenyan politics. And of course, this is something that all political actors are aware of. There was and continues to be discussion that maybe it would be ideal that every male running mate has a female, every male candidate has a female running mate. If you're looking at the presidential position and the governors, for example, so that we may try as much as possible to achieve gender parity. And Raila Odinga, who was one of the main contestants for the elections and unfortunately lost, well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, was during the launch of his party's manifesto was very clear that his choice of a female running candidate was very well thought through and very well informed. And in his words, he said it was time that we reciprocate the efforts that Kenyan women have put into the political space. And it is time that we have a woman in the executive. And that woman was Ms. Martha Karua, herself a human rights activist, a lawyer, very much active in Kenyan politics. But unfortunately, their party, the Azimio La Umoja coalition, did not win the elections. But nonetheless, as you can see here, both coalitions had very clear gender-specific goals in their manifestos on what they would like to achieve. And as you can see here, they have even specific timeframes on how they want to achieve this. And you're looking at financial inclusion, political inclusion, and just the promotion of the well-being of women, dealing with issues of security and just general socioeconomic well-being. And if you are to look at these manifestos, you'd see that there is keen awareness because the goals are more or less similar. So there's this general awareness of what the issues are and how they can be addressed. And the question still remains, are they or will they be addressed? And that is something I'm hoping we will be able to discuss today.
Sheila, can you change the slide?
What do you mean change the slide?
It's the same slide showing on the screen.
Yeah, I'm now on slide number 5.
We see slide number 5, so I guess.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
I was discussing number 4, and I'm now at number 5.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. All right. So now, after this launching of manifestos and the electoral processes, what was the outcome? And unfortunately, even with this awareness and the continued struggle for the inclusion of women and fairness in their representation, we ended up not performing very well because overall, out of 1,882 positions, only 186 women were elected. Of course, none in the executive, unfortunately. And out of 47 governors, we had only 7 women. Out of the 47 is to represent the 47 counties. So for the governors, 7, which was an increase from 3 in the previous elections. Senators, 3, so the same number as we had in 2017. And for women, up at 29, an increase from 23, but still 29 out of 290 MPs is a very unfortunate results. But of course, we have the saving grace of the women representatives, 1 from each of the 47 counties, which helps to bring up the number. So if you're looking descriptively speaking, then we have better looking results on women's representations overall. And of course, it was very, very key to note in this election cycle, the performance of one specific county, that was Nakuru, who managed to meet the gender quota and reported the highest number of women elected to office. So you have constituencies where you had from the member of the county assembly all the way to the governor, because the governor is a woman, they had women representatives getting elected. Unfortunately, however, despite the manifesto that the winning coalition presented, the newly constituted cabinet does not reflect gender parity, and the just concluded exercise of also nominating cabinet secretaries, unfortunately, does not meet that, because in both spaces we have less than 30% of women as nominated persons. So that's that brings the question of why, I mean, it's not in a period of less than 3 months, we already see the promise of, achieving gender parity being broken. And now that raises the question, should we have hope that we are going to achieve gender parity? Because part of the promise was that they will be able to achieve this or have a system in place towards the realization of the 2/3 gender rule according to the constitution within 12 months. But then in the first 3 months already, it doesn't seem like we are heading in that direction, but that it might be too early to tell, but we shall see. So as I refer to the constitutional compensation, the constitutional requirement that no more than 2/3 of the members of elective public bodies shall be of the same gender. And already, as I mentioned, the cabinet and the cabinet secretaries fall short of this requirement. And if you look at the Senate here as well, we are still falling short of that. And, this is a very nice visual representation to see just how, how we are performing when you're looking at the total number of seats and how many women are present there. We have the representatives. I mean, in the case of representing special interest groups, it's fair because it's pretty straightforward. But the question still remains how we are going to ensure that at the ballot, women perform closer to their male counterparts, if not at par or better, and what the problem might be there. Here, when you're looking at the parliament as well, only 29 women were elected out of 290 positions. That's only 10%. Again, falling way short of the 30, if you could call it that, 30% minimum. And if you are to look at from 2010 up to this year's election, if you're looking at the progressive voting in of women, it will take us until the year 252 before the National Assembly actually gets to realize the constitutional requirement. And that's basically left to, if you're just looking at the voting habits alone, which doesn't raise much hope or give much hope anyway, that just leaving the situation as it is and leaving it down to the electorate, that more women will get freely elected into parliament, and calls for discussions on what other measures do we need to put in place, where do we need to put in more effort, what groups do we need to focus on, what efforts do we need to put in place, do we focus on sensitization, or do we go for proper push for adherence to the constitution, and if so, how? Because so far there have been several proposals, but unfortunately nothing has managed to work through. So something that is also worth mentioning, that is, as you can see here with the parliament, no numbers to meet the requirement, and no laws or no formulas that have been agreed upon that will ensure that this is able to be achieved. But at the county level, we have the requirement that should the 2/3 gender rule not be met, there should be the nomination of this number of enough members to ensure that this constitutional requirement is met. So it's just there, very explicit, but only for the county governments, but not for the county government assemblies, but not for the National Assembly. And although this is of course adhered to, it's there, it's very straightforward from the constitution, but then it brings about another discussion of how do we go about nominating these members, these women, who are these women? Because of course there has been criticism that it's used as a way to appease the men who've lost, so they get to nominate, because it's down to the parties, they get to nominate their family members. And here you're looking at wives, and as other people would like to argue, girlfriends, but it's basically not a requirement that has measures in place that would ensure that we are actually having competent women who come in, who have the interests of women at heart, and will actually put effort into promoting gender equality and the well-being of women as part of the discussions in the House. So the biggest problem of having this list, although it allows us to meet the constitutional requirement, is that we just tick the box of, okay, 2/3 of the assembly is women, but leaves us still with the question of, are these women really pro-women? And even if they're pro-women, do they have the space and the ability to shape discussions and laws and outcomes and policies on pro-women agendas? And with that, I hand over to Diana, who will then move into the issue of the experiences of women, especially looking at violence against women who are active in politics.
So apart from the focus on the quota perspective, it's also important to look at other barriers against women in politics. So one of these barriers is violence, which should be looked at in a broad sense. I mean, this election didn't bring about like generalized electoral violence, but there's still the existence of violence against women in politics, both physical with harassment, assaults, intimidation, abuse, and destruction of property, and psychological, for example, insults and degrading talk. This is how Bjarnegård defines it. But it is important to note that these different forms of violence are not mutually exclusive, and they can kind of function at the same time. And it can be both online and offline. And in the election year 2022, it was just in the post-COVID setting where violence generally against women had increased, which made women especially vulnerable. So it was at a kind of a critical time. So especially the psychological violence is at a very high level. There's a kind of an Afrobarometer survey that states that 53% of Kenyans believe women in politics are likely to be criticized or harassed, meaning that, for example, women can be advised not to get into politics from family and friends and so on. However, the same Afrobarometer survey also indicated that women can gain some standing in the local communities from being involved in politics. So in the policy note, we have a quotation from a woman active in politics stating that I was forced to step down because the community cannot be led by a woman. I was told if I wanted to be, I should focus on the woman representative seat, which somehow indicate that there are patriarchal attitudes in terms of women's leadership, trying to keep women out of political offices, and that if women want to compete in politics or be part of the political or public arena, they should kind of be confined to this women representative seat and not compete with the men for the other seats available. And it's not always that these women seats are thought of thought as highly of as other positions in politics. There's also a documentary from BBC about violence against women in Kenyan politics, where it comes out from some of those who are part of that documentary, among others, Patience Nwanga, that we have with us here in this webinar, that some women have been exposed to threats of being gang raped, and some have been exposed to intimidation in the sense of being kissed on the campaign trails and so on, which is also a form of violence. And then there are, in the policy note, we are also talking about some of the institutional barriers. For example, the institution in charge of elections, Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, was quite ill prepared for the election in terms of underfunding and also staffing, as the highest position was vacant until 5 months before the election. But generally, there is a high level of trust in the judiciary. But the High Court suspended an IEBC decision on blacklisting political parties which do not meet the gender quota, which kind of questions the actual commitment for the implementation of this quota. And it comes out as if it's perceived as more of a political choice than a legal obligation. There are also other institutional barriers. For example, the monetarization of politics in Kenya with the electoral system, the winner takes it all, meaning the exclusion of all opposition parties. And this is a system which is not very welcoming for newcomers, which is kind of similar to what can also be found in the Kenyan context, for example. But yet the data indicate that some of these women who actually competed in not the recent, but the 2070 election, they were actually spending more than the men. But they're not winning quite as often in a sense. So there's also this focus on not only big man politics with a focus on client and patron relations and patronage, matronage, but also big women who need to demonstrate that they're equally capable. But behind all this are also those who would perhaps had to withdraw or who didn't win their seats because of a lack of funding. So behind some of the small wins that Sheila pinpointed in relation to the election results is also efforts by the women's organization. For example, FIDA Kenya had this Vote a Data campaign, which I believe is supposed to mean vote for your sister. Sheila, you must correct me if I'm wrong.
Vote a sister, yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And also training programs to kind of try and change the political discourse in a more friendly position for women in politics and opening up the political spaces. So as you can see from the figures that Sheila also pointed out, it's a very small number of women candidates also, which is also an area that should be a focus on not just those who are elected, but also those who actually contest for political positions. And then we have again this Nakuru County, which is the only place that the gender quota was met, with an all-women leadership. But there's also an Africa Barometer survey that shows that 56% of women in Kenya do not feel close to any political party, which is almost 20% more than the men. So we can ask if there's a kind of a potential governance crisis in relation to political parties underlying all this. And it has also come out that particularly this election had a relative low voter turnout. But I'm not sure we have the evidence to say if this has been beneficial or not against the representation for women in politics. Some of the recommendations we have as a part of the policy note is that, maybe not surprisingly, that political parties need to respect the two-thirds gender principle in their list of nominees. And the new National Assembly should legislate a formula for gender parity. And also that measures need to be put in place to address this violence against women in politics through joint efforts by IEBC, the National Gender and Equality Commission, and women's organizations, who also have a very important role to play. And as a part of that, there needs to be support for women candidates exposed to violence with clear systems for reporting and counseling, and political parties need to make a very clear stance against gendered violence. Also, these institutional barriers should be addressed on a more long-term basis, including the very competitive electoral system and monetarization of politics. Thank you, and I believe this is the end. So I would like to ask Ruto from Mandalelo Wanawake for some reactions or for a short intervention. Please, the platform is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all of you for inviting us into this webinar this evening. I think on behalf of Maendeleo, which was very involved, first is to say that as an organization, we turned 70 years this year. We were started in 1952 and we turned 70 years this year. So we had a countrywide celebrations from February 28th all the way to the last one in Nairobi, 2nd of August. And it was through these celebrations, because normally we do them every 10 years. This particular time we felt as an institution, we need to go out to the grassroots, honor our surviving founding members in the country. And so we went to 8 regions and we started in Western Kenya. It was the second celebration on that 1st of March, which was in Thika in Mount Kenya, where we had invited Martha Karua, because she comes from Central, that she came to this meeting. And I think everything about our candidature started that day. When we said as an institution, we think it is time that we need a deputy president as a woman. We want to be on the table. And that time we had Mother, and the rest is history. I think the whole story started from that day. From there, of course, we went to the other regions. So what are we saying? We are saying we went through the political cycle and we've done it. I've been involved from 2002, when I stood myself for a member of parliament. Some of the questions you're asking are very clear, but where I'm married is not where I'm born. So I was a case study. I realized that on my part, it was difficult to get elected because that is not where I'm born. So I didn't stand again for member of parliament. I think the challenges and the issues you've talked about, the gender-based violence, the 2 political parties, we as an institution, so that I come back again, the case we made was that each of the running mates, whether it was Kenya Kwanza and whether it was Azimio, which Maendeleo as an institution supported, because we work with the government, and that is where the head of state, the former head of state, had thrown his support. We were very clear on the women, and we are surprised because the numbers actually went down, because in 2017, we had, even as an institution, 40 county members of parliament. Now they have gone down. So I think as we continue with the webinar, we have our views on where we feel, or I feel, that we need to work together so that the trainings are done on time. Because when you have 1,450 wards, which like Maendeleo, we have representatives in all the wards. And then countrywide, we are only getting 100 MCAs, just another 3 from 97. That is not very good. We have an opportunity to get almost 300-400 county members of parliament from this institution. But of course, we will be sending our questions on where our issues may be. On the women, what we call the single constituencies, we really hoped we would go to about 50, but of course we got 26. I think we went 3 from 23. You have that history. So yeah, I think that's what I would want to say for now. The cabinet, this particular time, we feel that we've done better because we had 7 cabinet secretaries in the former government. Now we have 10 appointed, together with the advisors who sit on a cabinet position. So now out of 24, we have 10. I think the story now is on the permanent secretaries, and we are hopeful that we may be lucky to see what happened with the CSs, but we leave that to the head of state to give us that decision. So for now, I think that's what I want to say on behalf of this institution of about 4 million women, with structures in the whole country. Where I head is the national office. I have 11 national officials. I have 47 county chairs who are members of my board. That is a board of 58 countrywide. I have 290 sub-county team and 1450. I mean, we should be able to do the change which is needed in the 2/3 gender rule in this country. I thank you for now.
Okay, thank you very much. I would also like to remind the audience to post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And now I will turn to Maureen Odera for a short intervention. Please, the platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, and for everyone who's joined the webinar. I think in terms of quick reactions, I know there's a very strong focus on the outcomes of the elections in terms of how the process was conducted, but then we always tend to zoom in terms of who won, who didn't, who made it where, who didn't. Based off of the report that Sheila had presented upon together with Diana, I think I'm going to have a few initial reactions to some of the statistics that we have been seeing everywhere. The thing about affirmative action when it comes to the 2/3 rule, there's always a very big conversation around why are we still not at the 30% mark? And I always ask the question, why are we not questioning why the systemic structures in place are not pushing those numbers up? They do increasingly seem to go up with every election, but it's at a very slow pace. And I think as it was pointed out earlier, I think by Ruth, where they were looking at the number of candidates in a specific role or position in 2017 was higher than it was in 2022. So the percentages are slowly rising, but they're very unpredictable. There are very many factors that come towards it. So back to the big question, why are we not moving forward? It's like we take one step backward and we take 25 steps back. And at a personal level and also from an institutional level, we've been questioning what is the root cause of the problem. And there are several things that we have identified. For example, it's the perception of who a leader should be or who a leader should look like. And we had a lot of questions internally in terms of why should it matter that at least out of the, I'm just reading from some of my notes, that 4 of the 6 women, for example, who enter in an elected position are, the focus is on them, not from a positive space. It is always from blights in their political records, whether it's in the current election or it's in their history from either in different political positions or even in their personal lives as when they now run into office. That's what we seem to focus on. The other thing is that should we just be content that the presence of women is enough? Why does it have to be comparative vis-a-vis the men, for example? Because there's no way of being a leader that's defined by gender. You are either a leader or you aren't, but then we tend to focus leadership conversations, especially political leadership conversations around gender. When we celebrate devolution, for example, are we still considering the fact that Kenya has the lowest proportion of women in parliament across East Africa? Yet these countries in themselves are blatantly failing in other aspects of human rights. So they can tout to have more women in parliament, but if you weigh, if you're to put them on a scale vis-a-vis Kenya, in terms of human rights advancements, even with the fewer women in power, we seem to be doing better. So I really question sometimes in terms of where our focus is in recognizing the number of female political leaders who've made it. And ultimately it rests with the question of, do we have to choose between patriarchy and authoritarianism? Why can't it just be leadership based off of merit or experience or popularity, because it's not really entirely based on your gender. The other thing that came out across is the number or the incidences of violence that female political candidates face. And the media seems to focus a lot on the violence that happens during the election period, but nobody's having a conversation around the violence that happens before the election, during the campaign period, during nomination by political parties, where we have a lot of female candidates who are already even being pushed out of the opportunity of getting on the ballot paper even before the race has begun, where they're being forced to practice pragmatism or step down for more, for the male counterparts who are not necessarily better qualified. You find a lot of the women who run under these political parties do more within the community than the male counterparts. But then when it comes to putting party nominations up, we have a lot of women being nudged out of those positions even before election or campaign period starts. And then we've been socialized to believe that a young man who goes into leadership is possibly perceived as having more potential than a woman going into the same position. We've had incidences, say, in the 2017 election where we had a young candidate, I think he was 23 or something, and he was called before the Council of Elders, which again is a very social structural thing where the community leaders front up their preferred candidate. Better yet, if it's a man, the women have to fight for that validation. And for this particular candidate, in fact, one of the older politicians or someone who's more seasoned in that space awarded him with a car just because he's a young man who fronted himself up for politics. And you see the celebration of that as reinforcement of how we already struggle with internalizing the fact that women could make great political leaders just because they are built into leadership. We also look at the thing around representation from a gender lens. When we look at the candidates who make it to the ballot paper, our country or the constitution currently now has at least a 5% allocation for the candidates, for political candidates or who are living with disabilities or persons of disability. But then we realize even from the point of registration at the office of the political registrar, they are not given that allocation. Very few get to make it there, and they suffer the same challenges that female candidates suffer. So you either have to step down or you settle for a lesser role, again, practice pragmatism, or you are bullied out of the space, or you have to run as an independent candidate. And we know that running a campaign is expensive. So already you've been sidelined before the race has begun, which takes us into the conversation around money. Kenya seems to run the most expensive elections continuously across the world. And the numbers in terms of what to spend in elections get to be higher and higher. But who benefits from this money? There's money that's allocated, say, to the OPPR. There's money that's allocated to IEBC. There's money that goes directly to the parties, but still we're struggling to meet the needs of elections. So that aside, if we look at the structural mechanisms around being ready or election preparedness, when you take it down to the campaign trail, we realize on average you're needing not less than 20 million to run a campaign. We already know that there's such a big parity in terms of financial inclusion for women in very many other sectors. So when it comes to the election period, how then do we fundraise for these gender minorities to give them a head start within the political space? And of course, the last but not least, and it's been spoken on the most, is the violence meted out towards these candidates. At HPS, we have a program where we support a partner who works with young student leaders at university level. So the university model of electing student leaders is very, very mirrored off of how we run our national elections as a country. And you find that the IEBC also monitors that process. And what we found is that the level of violence towards female students at tertiary level is extremely shocking. We have people who are physically attacked, people who are assaulted, people whose grades go missing, people who drop out of school. We currently have a documentary out, and it talked about one student leader who ran for political office at a local university, and she ended up getting kicked out of school. And the mom literally died of shock the instant when she was told her daughter has been suspended, because you think of what the community has done to get this girl to where she is. And then because she vied for leadership and the school administration had a problem with the way that they were defending the students, she got suspended, but it led to the death of a parent. I cannot imagine the trauma that that young lady had to carry through for the rest of her life. And she completely dropped out of school. We've had incidences where young students in universities have been assaulted by fellow students, and the school administration take themselves out of the conversation. They say that this is student run, it's student led, it's not their business, they have no control over what happens, yet some of these incidences happen within the school environment. So why is this important? Because the way they run the elections at the university level completely mirrors what happens at national level. We have women who've been intimidated out of positions of power. We have women who their political opponents either sexualize or feminize their weak points to make them appear less than. We had, in this current election, we had two major political opponents pitted against each other. And I remember driving down one of our highways where they had a male candidate and a female candidate, both being fronted by the same political party, but the messaging on the billboard is completely different. The man has been portrayed as a leader, as capable of being a man of the people, but the hashtag that was used on the female billboard is, they used a hashtag that contained a slur that is used to really sexualize women within our country. Like it was hashtag a girl toto something. And I mean, in a social setting where you are, for others it might be right to use that context, but I imagine this is someone vying for a national office position, and you as a political party decide to paint her in this light. This is same political party, male candidate, female candidate, and the billboards were on opposite sides of the road. It was alarming, and they continuously did that to the male candidates and the female candidates for that specific party. So as a member of the voting public, it begs to question what imprint is in my mind when I look at the two candidates. Where am I going to cast my vote? And on what grounds am I going to use to cast my vote, either for the male or the female candidate? We've had incidences where women's validation is put into question in terms of whether they're single, married, have children. And I ask myself, why does it matter? We do not have the same expectations for male candidates. We do not have the same pressure that we give female candidates in how they present themselves, in how they address the crowd. As we speak, even within this current government, when they did the nominations for the County Assembly speakers, we only had one female speaker who made it. Out of all the counties that we have as a nation, we only elected one female candidate as our speaker. And that's perplexing, because are you saying then that all the other candidates who are fronted, who are female, are not qualified? Or is it only men who can represent the assembly? Or is it men's voice that we recognize as an authority within the assembly? It begs a lot of questions. As we speak right now, the Law Society of Kenya has fronted a petition into the courts that stopped the vetting of 51 principal secretaries. And that's because they are challenging the candidates that have been forwarded from a regional and gender imbalance. Because when we look at the 51 people fronted, it's very clear that it's very favoring of men and it's very favoring of specific regions. So now the big question is, if I go back to the presentation that Sheila had, where she was looking at the manifesto that was presented by the current president, it begs the question now, is he going to stick to the manifesto and honor what he promised to the people, or is he going to succumb, like we've seen in previous governments, where they say one thing, but they don't support, there's no action behind their words. So again, when we look at the affirmative action of the 30% rule, I always take it back to what are the structural or the social mechanisms that will keep holding us back from attaining that 30%. The perception that we have for women in leadership, the cultural and social practices or indoctrination we have as a nation when we look at leaders from a gender perspective as opposed to a merit and qualification perspective will always come into play. If we do not address the violence that female or gender minorities actually face when they're running for office, then we're in trouble. On the flip side,
you will have to round up.
Oh, sorry, my time is up. Sorry. I think the last important point, this was the first time we actually had representation in terms of electoral observers from the LGBTQI community. One of our partners had a project that was dubbed Queering the Ballot. And we worked extensively with that partner in ensuring that at least 20% of electoral observers within the coastal region were members of the LGBTQI community. That's a first for the country. We have never had that kind of representation at the electoral office or during campaign period or during the election period. So my quick reactions to some of the things that have been presented, that could be it. I know they all came off as questions, but I think for as long as we don't have those answers, we will not keep meeting this magic number that we want to see. So if we focus on the numbers, then we need to ask ourselves the questions. What do we need to do to make sure we get to those numbers? Thank you, Diana.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to Patience Nyanga.
Thank you very much. I've been
Your sound is very poor.
Okay, let me see if I can change my.
Now it's fine.
Now it's fine. Okay, cool. So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be part and parcel of this conversation. I have listened to all the speakers who've spoken before, and yes, the cases represent my country, Kenya. And so I don't think I have much to add or new things to say, but I'm going to share a few screens because I have just made a presentation which I feel some of the things have already been spoken about or maybe have been tackled. So whatever has been said, maybe I wouldn't speak to it. I'll just add something new. So I'm happy to share my screen. Yeah, can you see Diana on your end? Yeah, cool. So this is Patience. I said I defined myself as a media and communications and advocacy specialist in Kenya. I have a new role as of yesterday. Now I will be joining the Association of Media Women in Kenya as the executive director. So going forward, I'm happy and pleased to work with the rest of you in issues to do with women in media in this country. Thanks, Maureen. Well, we've been speaking about the gender agenda in Kenya, and I think so far, as we've said, that we signed in the new constitution in 2010, and our statistics indicate that at least 4,000 women have presented themselves and vying for the various political seats, including the presidential, gubernatorial, senatorial, and woman representative seat, member of the National Assembly, as well as the County Assembly. But then as we continue, most of the issues that have been discussed here, and especially following the policy note or the policy paper presented by Mia and Sheila, represent the Kenyan issues or represent the issues that affect women in Kenya. So while we have the numbers, and I acknowledge the fact that women are there and have brought themselves forward to vie for these political seats, we have generational or institutional injustices against the women in Kenya. And that's why even as we continue, moving every electioneering period, we have women coming or presenting themselves for these seats, yet the numbers are still not there. Though, as Ruth has said from Maendeleo and Awake, we really we acknowledge the fact that women now, we have the numbers that we can really boast and show around and say, well, we have some numbers here. For example, in the governor seat, which is one of the seats that I vied for in this 2022 general election in Kenya, in 2013, we had no woman governor. In 2017, we had 3. And then, of course, in 2022 now, we had about 23 women presenting themselves to vie for the seat. And then finally, we have 7 who made it to become the governors in Kenya, the women governors in Kenya. And so we can say there's some progress. As much as it's progress in small strides, we still acknowledge that there is progress. Global data show that women are represented at all levels of decision-making levels. So it's not just a Kenyan case, but it is a case that is actually a global phenomenon. And therefore, achieving gender parity in political life is far off the target. In Kenya, women's representation is still below the constitutional threshold of 33 and below the SDG's target of 50%. So we are still not there, and we are lagging behind as a country. We are hoping that in 2027, we'll have probably more women presenting themselves. And even as they do that, we still have a time to take stock of what has happened, or probably talking to more women who have been in this since before, or have probably taken the decision to vie for elective positions, so that we can talk to them, understand what were the challenges, what did they do, and then what are some of the new things that they can bring on board? How else can we try and help them even as we go to 2027? Public and political life is characterized by low representation of women in decision-making, as we already said. Although women constitute 50.5% of the Kenyan population, political representation is still heavily skewed in favor of men. So most of the time as women, we go through a lot of problems, and really if we're going to put them in, say this is probably matters that affect all of us, regardless of the county that you represent. Gender discrimination, this is, as Ruth has said, probably in some of those conversations, you don't belong here. A woman doesn't belong anywhere. You come from the county, but you marry in a different county. When you go home, the question is, why didn't you vie for this political seat in the county that you married in? Or you're a young woman who is still looking for a position and you're not married yet. The question is, what happens when we give you this seat, or you get this seat and then you get married elsewhere? So women are looked from a perspective of where do you belong? And then the question is, where do I belong? So for those who are actually probably brought up in my county, for example, Taita Taveta, which is very patriarchal. So women are brought up there, and then they're not looking for this seat. A lot of the time, it's probably somebody who's gone out, maybe married elsewhere, but still has a desire to see the county change, and therefore they will always want to come back in one way and steer the leadership there. But then the questions get asked all the time. There's of course, stereotyping of women. How many women do we have already taking leadership positions? Can women take this leadership position? And especially when you are really higher the rank. And in Kenyan setting now, we have the presidential position, and then we have the governor position, the senator position, the women representative position, where everyone feels like all the women need to belong there. So every time you present yourself for an elective post, especially when it's up the ladder, everyone is looking at you and asking you, why don't you want to go for the women position? Why don't you want to go for this position that is a woman position? And so the question then begs, what about all these other positions? Because the constitution in Kenya does not define gender for any of these elective positions. And therefore, I strongly believe that both women and men are able to take this position. All they need is to really craft their campaign and to really say it's possible that they're able to take this. And for those who are already taking the positions, then they have no choice but to do their very best so that we can continue using them as examples. The other thing is just really these challenges and managing family and career pressures. Most of the time, you really want to balance between all this. You want to, campaigns are very expensive. So you are faced with the task that you have to keep working in relation to you trying to get time off to go to, campaign trail or to go to the field and talk to the people. And yeah, so it's really a challenge, I think, for most of women. Another thing is unequal opportunities. Most of the time, the patriarchal society and socialization and really understanding that men are set for these positions, but then women, there is a problem. And in Kenya, I would say my country has many women who already taking leadership positions in various perspectives and in various fields. And so last year I did a series of women, we called it Kenya Women Series, and profiled all the women in various political spaces and in government positions and in key leadership positions. And talked to the women, interviewed them, spoke to them about their career journey so that we could inspire a generation to see that even you can get here. There's challenges, yes, but well, it's possible that women can go up. The current representation of women in Parliament, National Assembly, and the Senate stands as 27, which includes nominated women, comparable to its, when we compare ourselves to East African countries, including Rwanda, which is leading at 61%. We have Burundi at 38%, Tanzania 37%, Uganda 35%, and of course, coming next is really South Sudan at 28.46%. So ideally, when we think about all this, we are at a place where we are lagging behind, and we hope that it changes. And as it changes, as we say, there were commitments, presidential commitment with the current regime or the current government, which promised 50-50. We are still calling for the government to ensure that there are many other positions that are coming, and we would like to see that there are many more women taking up these positions. In Kenya, the end of an election signifies the beginning, and of course, it's really a chance for us to think about the reflection of achievements, think about the lessons learned and the opportunities they are in. So as it is now, I belong to a number of groups that were women who vied for various elective positions in Kenya. We are having conversations and asking ourselves what next. So we were there, the lessons that we have learned, we have reflections to tell, and how can we craft the next strides, or the women who, how can we prepare them for the elective positions? So this is some of the things that we are thinking right now. We are thinking we need to continue creating a space for women, a platform for experience sharing, again, for women, reflecting on what worked, what did not work, and collectively informing advocacy messages way before the electioneering period. So within these 5 years, well, it's time to rest, it's time to think ahead, it's time to energize, it's time to think of, taking positions in various careers. But well, even as we think about that, if we are in elections, in elective positions, then well, we might want to start planning ahead. At the same time, I think this is really also a challenge for us to enhance and promote coordination and awareness of women's role in advancing peace and security during the electioneering period, so that these conversations, as they're happening, we are also in part and parcel of those conversations. We are telling people of what transpired and how our role can be an important role in advancing security during the electioneering period. The other thing we hope to do is identify existing gaps and opportunities to design strategic support and advocacy interventions to increase the visibility of women candidates on the campaign trail. In Kenya, we have a tendency most of the time, and I want to believe this is really a global a trend, that women are profiled wrongly when it comes to, how do we portray women in media, and how can we create more spaces for visibility of these women way before the electioneering period and well before we start elections. So even by the time we get there, as much as we're asking who is Patience Nyange, we probably know her from before. And because we know we've written about her, we've read about her, we've seen the work that she's done in the other positions that she has held before, then we have some level of acceptability and some level of confidence in her that she's done well before, and now we know we can actually agree, and we can see her as part and parcel of the leadership in our communities. The other thing we also want to do is to raise awareness on the general public on women's participation in politics and their role in promoting women's empowerment and inclusion. It's a beautiful thing to see women in these spaces. And this year I looked at a photo that was the first photo that was taken during the first cabinet in 1963. And while we have the president there and the rest of the other people standing with him, his cabinet was all male. So this time round, when we have 10, as she said, Ruth, we have about 10 women's cabinet secretaries. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see that the women are in the spaces which are decision-making spaces. Our voices matter, and we want to be in spaces that we think will be able to shape where we go from now. Well, I'd like to stop here because I think a lot of the things that I had planned to say, some of them have been said by my Kenyan counterparts, so I really don't think I have anything new. The other thing maybe I would have said is our challenge to women who already are taking up leadership positions. What do we need to do, or what is the role there? I think the mentorship for me is a big thing, that every woman who is in a leadership position, she needs to be strategic about mentoring other people behind her. In the event that she takes up a new role, there's somebody who can easily replace her, and there's a good transition right there. And then I think a positive working culture where women have taken leadership roles, and I think it's good for them to be able to lead in a way that we all now can change our mind and say, wow, women too can do great things. The other thing is for us to continue holding into account government's commitment to gender parity. The current regime, as we said, promised 50-50. We're still championing for that 50-50. We're still presenting more names to be presented and to take up leadership roles in various positions. Well, that's my contribution for this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patience. Now I will pose some of the questions from the Q&A section. There's one question from Belinda Glover stating, I would like to know how the 2/3 law is implemented in Kenyan's parliament, knowing that they're facing enforcement challenges currently. I don't know, Sheila, if you can elaborate a bit on this.
This question of enforcement is the well, I don't know if it's a big elephant because it's there. It's very obvious to see. It remains to be the biggest question because we've had very, well, disappointing but also embarrassing instances of when the House needs to get together, discuss, okay, fine, we have this issue, we cannot seem to be able to agree on a formula to be able to achieve this, so how do we do it? And you just have people employing tactics like, walking out or just creating chaos just so that people don't have to finally make a decision on this. So at the national parliament, it remains a question. There are many possible answers suggested to how this can be achieved, but it's still at we don't know yet. So it's the question of, I think it was the Supreme Court's judgment that there was going to be progressive realization, and the question is how slow or how fast is this progressiveness going to be, and how much space for the progressiveness is there? Because if we go by the current statistics, as I mentioned before, then we can wait until the year 252 and still argue that it's progressive. But the question becomes, is this acceptable? Is this right? Is this just? And I don't know, maybe we are not there yet with the current House, but maybe that will become an active point of discussion after all these appointments and vetting exercises are over, that, hey, look, we are actually in violation of the Constitution in our Constitution as a membership here. So how do we address this? So at this point, it's a matter of, okay, so what will be the point moving forward? How do we address this? At the county level, it's very clear. You've not achieved the numbers, then you have to top up. But there is no such clear call for meeting this gender quota at the national parliament.
No, and no sanctioned either, as far as I understand.
Well, I mean, the right thing, if you would like to put it that way, to do was to say, look, the national parliament is in violation of the Constitution, so it should not be there. But I don't think anybody wants to have that, because what exactly would that mean then? Do we cancel the elections and start over, and will we be doing this until we actually get to the numbers, or what do we do? Or do we just accept that, look, we are in violation of the Constitution, but we could commit ourselves to ensuring that we address this as soon as possible? But again, that's where we are. What's the way forward? It remains still a question. And it's also, again, I think you mentioned it, it's a question of, is it a question of political will, or is it just something that's institutionally or structurally difficult to achieve or unachievable? And that's the discussion we need to openly have.
Yeah, are there any of or other Kenyan representatives who have some comments on this?
Yeah, I think I would want to give an opinion on the 2/3, where Maendeleo has really been involved from the beginning to, I'm literally talking about when we got the 47 seats. It took a lot of, a lot of work from this institution. And, I remember the Honorable Charity Ngilo, the Honorable Mother Karua, were in Naivasha with all the men there fighting for at least the 47. And I remember we were all, in town, Mama Ida, Odinga, the current CJ, we had meetings in City Hall, we had meetings up to all the way to Parliament. And when the 47 seats were then the only thing we could get, Martha and Charity walked out to Naivasha and they said, let us take what we have. And so Maendeleo is really in the history of this, and we can confirm that's how the 47 seats have come in. I have two questions I would want to say. One is that we Kenyan women, when we get these seats, there are big disparities here in poverty. It should be very clear, and we'll be lobbying for some, some trainings with the leaders, first of all, before we even go very far to the 2/3, which I'm going to give an opinion. I may be wrong, but what is this one thing as Kenyan women we want to achieve when we get into these positions of power, whether at the County Assembly, whether at Parliament? Of course, we did everything to be in the Deputy President's seat, where we knew we would be next to the seat of power. We did not make it. We are back to where we are now. We need to be able to achieve for the majority of Kenyan women. We have so many women living in poverty. There are changes which need to be done when they are in these positions of power. Having said that, I want to suggest how I think from this institution, we can try. Political will, I agree, has got to be there. But The funding sometimes we have seen, and we get invited to, to meetings where we can only speak. We are just a speaker, like when there was the meeting on Dada, Chagua Dada, you go and you just speak and that's it. I think the donor world would need to consider an institution like this one, which has networks all the way from the grassroots, all the way to the top where I am. If really we were supported and we did training in advance, it is possible to actually actualize the 2/3 gender rule. I'm not saying Maendeleo is the only one, but I'm saying that funding sometimes is in small, with people who don't have the grassroots support. We have a very big grassroots support. I am not fundraising, but I am saying if we were brought into this picture where we really start training our women, we have 1450, like the wards, women elected at the wards. We have women in the sub-county. We have women in the county. If these trainings were done on time, I am sure these numbers can improve, because in 2017, we went around with the former First Lady and we were able to get 40 MCAs. Today, we do not have them. So I have this thing that the donor world also needs to use bigger institutions when you are funding, so that the numbers are reached. And then that way, we can not only have the 47 we are sure of, we can try in 2027. Can we get some 200 MCAs? Can we try to see if this number of the 26 of Parliament can move to about 50? I think is doable, but I think a lot of training needs to be done. Let me comment on IEBC, and sorry, my name is Rahab, not Ruth. We can correct that. On IEBC, I want to say the trainings were not done. They were our neighbors here. I'm 1 minute from the IEBC offices. We wrote, and there was no civic education. CEO, can I confirm that? Absolutely, there was no civic education. So truly, when you look at the Kenyan ballot box, when you look at the 6 papers, for an old woman, because I deal with the grassroots women, when you look at those papers, unless a known mama is guided, she will also be guided to put the votes where the agent wants her to put the votes. So really, I think I want to vote IEBC and say that there was no civic education. So let me leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will look into another question. And this one is from Josephine Ahikira, which is one of the NAI associates. She is asking, how are the women's seats arrived at, and are they inscribed in the constitution? What factors animate the pockets of success in Kenya? It seems that Kenya is going to be one of the few examples of small incremental gains of women, but embedded in deep democratic struggles. Yes, Kenya is lagging behind in terms of numbers, but what about the democratic content of the regimes mentioned in Eastern Africa? What is your view? Sheila, do you have any perspectives on this?
Hi. Yeah, well, I'm just thinking when you're discussing the issue of the democratic content of the regimes around us in the other countries in East Africa, of course, we are looking at those that are deemed authoritarian and the benevolent dictatorship that is associated with Rwanda. And I guess it depends on where you lay across the fence and what your goals are, and the questions on how fast do you want what to be achieved. Like is it a question of prioritization, or is it a question of what would you rather have and at what cost? And I don't know. I would like to throw this question at Maureen, because I think I know at Heinrich Böll they really look into the issues of governance, and they do a lot of research, of applied research in this area. And I would like to know what feedback they get from the ground, because of course we could be here and thinking like, look, as Raila said, it's time we reciprocated the women's struggle and let women be in these positions of power. But it's the same thing. We know that we have that in the constitution. It's very well clearly laid out, but it's not achievable. But then on the other hand, some would argue that, there's an active, open and free democratic space. That's why as a woman, I can in any space air my opinions, and it might attract whatever backlash from a social perspective, but I know I am safe in the sense that nobody's going to come after me and kill me because I said something that goes against the figures in authority. So the question of a democratic space for the citizenship or the citizenry versus actual fair chance of occupation of the political space for all genders is something that, again, depends on what do you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it and how fast do you want to achieve it. So maybe Maureen can give us more insights on, how this correlation of the two very important aspects works out from the research and project management that they are actively engaged in. So I give it over to Maureen.
I think there's an intersection between what the law says and what the principles of democracy apply. If we look at our law as a nation, the IEBC, for example, has very clear guidelines in terms of, say, who can run for political office. Must be of sound mind, over 18, hold a national ID, be eligible to vote, and must register. If you're going in as an independent candidate, you must have gathered at least over 1,000 signatures from the community within which you're looking to represent, whether it's at senator or county or national level, you must have at least 1,000 signatures. You could go independently, you could go through a political party. Then we look, and why is this important? There's something Rahab said around civic education. We work under the assumption that the voting public understands our voting processes, that our voting public understands what are within our limits as citizens when it comes to electing or nominating people into positions of leadership. We work under the assumption that the political parties, because they have a very well-documented policy on how they front candidates, they're going to follow it. We work under the assumption that the office of the registrar of political parties is going to do their due diligence and investigate the different political parties and be very up to date with what the parties are doing. I've seen a comment here where it was talking about the Political Parties Fund and the Political Parties Amendment Act. We have great documentation as a nation, but where's the link between what we have on paper and what we practice? That is one of the gaps that I see lead to this problem in terms of democracy and the numbers that we see compared to our East African counterparts. Within the current constitution, there are certain positions that have been reserved for women. For example, the women's rep seat, no one can occupy that seat. It's an attempt to meet the 2/3 rule, but it's a very small percentage if you look at the whole country as a whole and the number of options we have for candidates. It's a very small percentage. We have seats around the MCA where you can vie as a woman, but you could also have a male counterpart there. And we've seen, as the history of the country has shown, a lot of the MCAs are men. You could go in as a county rep. Again, some of these positions are nominated, some of these are elected. So if you do not align yourself with the right political party within which the community you are representing, you stand to lose, because whether we accept it or not, as a nation, we are still very divided. One, not because of patriarchy alone, but we're also divided along tribal lines and ethnic biases. If you look at how devolution happened, how our counties are structured, it is around tribal lines. If you look at how we've named our counties, they're named, for some of the areas, they're named after the tribe of the people who live there, and that's the majority of the people who speak that tribe. So it sends a very subliminal message to your subconscious mind in terms of how do you think of a leader from that area who will represent your interests? Is it the person you associate with because of tribe or ethnicity, or is this person who you consider a foreigner because you do not align to their tribe or their ethnicity? So some of those things then do factor into how we vote, how we nominate, how we support candidates. And I really like—
You have to make it a bit short now, please.
Yeah. And I think to Rehab's point on civic education, we cannot ignore that. The IEBC is charged with the mandate for ensuring that a majority of the public is actually equipped with good information and good knowledge before they make a decision. That has been left at the responsibility of CBOs, of civil society and human rights organizations, and the goodwill of people. But the IEBC as an institution does almost nothing to educate the public in terms of electoral preparedness. And it does feed into how we vote and how we end up eventually electing the people that we elect.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see, Sheila, I don't know if you want to comment on this, or I would like us
Yes.
to...
I would just like, I need to leave very soon, but I would just like to make a comment just in follow-up to the comments.
Just very, very briefly, yes. Because I want us to also look a little bit at the successes.
All right. No, it's just a very brief comment on when we're discussing these issues of civic education. And it's important in this discourse to also highlight the role of the media in promoting or supporting or influencing the discourse of women as political agents, because we had a report here by Women in News, and they researched on the number of times women were mentioned compared to men in the concluded elections. And generally, the outcome was that women's voices remained muted, because women as sources of news relating to news was only at 15%, and women as main characters on this electoral process was only at less than 10%, at 9.7%. So I am glad that Patience now is in this space where we can bank on her support and activism in ensuring that the media also plays an active role in promoting the political and agency of women in Kenya. And I will have to run away now. Okay. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I would like if some of the participants could kind of have some, or could comment on, or have some perspective on what are the factors behind the pockets of success. For example, this Nakuru district with an all-women leadership. I don't know, Patience, if you have any inputs for that.
Well, as I listened to Sheila speaking, I needed to mention that it's not just the number of times. It's not just the number of times that women were mentioned, but also it's very important to look at how were they mentioned. As we said, most of the time the women are represented, probably the portrayal of women in media. At what time do we get to have them there? It's probably when there are scandals, it's probably there's something wrong, that's where we're putting them there. Yet the same share that we have as compared to the men, how they're portrayed, they're given the primetime news, a location, and then the women's stories probably come to the rest, to the end of the news. Again, it's not a problem that we will say we will squarely lay it to the media fraternity. Also, it's just for women. In media.
You seem to, your sound is not so good. The picture seems to be freezing.
Okay.
Okay,
Internet, probably. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you again. I don't know if you can say something about the factors behind some of these pockets of success in Kenya for women's political representation.
I think probably
I go ahead.
Yeah.
Patience, please. Okay,
as you said, part of the 50.
Okay, there seems to be a problem with the sound. I don't know if you we can have some perspectives on the factors behind the pockets of success from Maendeleo ya Wanawake.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think in Nakuru the cases are very clear. We must admit that politics needs a lot of money to be successful. And so the candidates we had in Nakuru, you know, the lady who went for the senator seat, this has been a big business lady in this country. It was her first time. And of course, they were in a party which was selling very well in that part of Kenya. So yes, the money was needed. The party was right for that particular region. Somebody has said, oh, we have all said Kenya is a tribal based a lot in politics. And then the lineup, the governor, she had been a senator before she came to stand for governor. She was completely outgoing. She was in the party now, which seems to have cleared most of the seats. And therefore that then ran down from governor, senator to the MCA. So once you get it right from the top, then it is possible to get it right all the way down. And of course, the president we have now, His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, has come from that party. So it was very clear to run down on the correct party and all the way into winning. I think that is what happened in Nakuru.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
you see it as a more specific event rather than something that can be replicated to other parts of the country.
Actually, Machakos, my county, did the same, 3 women, because the party was Wiper Party. So from the governor to the senator to the women rep, all the 3 of them won on the Wiper Party. So once the party is right, and you have the ticket from that party, there is a possibility of that kind of winning. So yes, it is being in the right party, because sometimes you can be going against the tide. Sometimes you may have little money to even fight the battle, but the party can fight the battle for you. Allow me to say something on the democratic space. Would I, or I come later?
I think I'm afraid the time is up, so we will have to
Okay.
close the
Okay.
space. I will just allow Patience a small comment because she was interrupted, and then I will end the webinar.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think for Nakuru, what Rahab has said is, I think some of the sentiments I will share, that will have been the case, I think, for even other counties where women also probably were present. The comment that I wanted to make initially was on the number of times that women were mentioned in media. And I said it was just not how number of times they were mentioned, but we also want to look at how what they mentioned as we compare to the male counterparts. Their portrayal on media is different most of the time, because what we see is when women probably are in scandals, or probably they have gone, against the wave, that's where probably we give them more publicity. But what we're trying to do, and I'm sure Maureen we're going to work together in this, is to try and see that women are also portrayed in the positive light when it comes to the portrayal in media, especially those within the political spaces.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the webinar has come to an end, but the debate has definitely not come to an end. We can see that from what has been going on in the Q&A and some of the comments we received, and also the contributions from 3 Kenyan representatives. So I would like to thank you all a lot. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the audience. I would also like to say that you can find the policy note on our homepage. That is nai.uu.se. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.